Hello and welcome back to another episode in the cancelled games series. This is the first one looking at unreleased games for a home computer, the Commodore 64, a favourite of many a young gamer in the 80s, particularly in the UK and Europe. I couldn't have made this episode without the wonderful resource that is Games That Weren't, which has tons of information on a plethora of cancelled C64 games. In fact, there are hundreds of them on there, so the C64 has more cancelled games than I've ever encountered for a system. I've whittled that huge list down to just 40, but if you're interested in seeing more or just reading more about the games mentioned in this video, head on over to GTW64, link in the description. Thanks to everyone who provided clips, especially Retro Longplays 79, and a huge thank you to Rob at Hellfire 64 who recorded some clips especially for this video, who are also linked below. So without further ado, let's take a look at the first 20 of 40 cancelled Commodore 64 games. Hyperion 2 was a side-scrolling shooter and planned sequel to Hyperion. Developed in 1988 by Chris Caress and Lee Corley, its development was very rushed because they wanted to show it off to publishers at an upcoming show. The fact that they rushed it meant that Hyperion 2 didn't have any programmed enemy attack patterns. Instead, they spent all night before the show manually entering the attack patterns using joysticks. For a game that was rushed out, it doesn't look too bad at all and has some great music from Matt Gray. Hyperion 2 was pitched to several potential publishers, but nobody was willing to take it on. One of these publishers, Mastertronic, was sent a disc containing the game, and this copy has managed to survive over the years, meaning that you can download and play it today. Bugs Bunny, full name Bugs Bunny Private Eye, was a platform game developed by Hi-Tech in 1992. This is one of the games that died along with Hi-Tech when the company went under in 92. Long thought to be incomplete, it was discovered when Games That Weren't spoke with the game's programmer Nick Taylor that it was in fact almost finished, and Hi-Tech founder David Palmer managed to pass a working copy onto them. Nick Taylor received payment for the game, so he attests that it was completed, and he was surprised that it wasn't released. The game wasn't quite complete as it didn't have any music, so I'll use some other classic Commodore 64 music in the background of this entry, but sound effects were present. Bugs Bunny has 4 platforming levels in which he collects carrots and avoids enemies, the usual platform game stuff. Bugs can also dig, creating tunnels underground which lead to caverns and mines, complete with rideable minecarts. The aim of each level is to collect evidence, tying in with the Private Eye part of the title, and then find a key to open a door at the level's end. Bugs then confronts the suspect using his camera flash, which can also be used throughout the levels to paralyse or scare off enemies. This version is complete apart from the lack of music and wasn't tested for bugs. Well, obviously, he's right there on the screen. Super Enduro Racer was an enhanced version 2 of the original, which wasn't too well received on the C64. Developed by Electric Dreams in 1987, it wasn't released, but somehow made its way onto a Bo Jolly compilation called the Big Box 30, which was discovered by an Australian gamer in 2011. This version is certainly an improvement over the original, having better graphics and sprites, but its frame rate is painfully slow. It's clearly unfinished as there's absolutely no hit detection, meaning that you can ride the motorbike anywhere without risk of crashing, and the bike doesn't interact with jumps either. Programmer Nick Pelling has stated that he did work on this enhanced edition of the game, which was to be a North American disc-only exclusive. He never finished the game, although he says it was close to completion, and never received payment, so assumes that it was cancelled pretty late in the development process. The fact that this made its way onto the Big Box 30 compilation was probably due to someone at Activision using the wrong master disc for the Aussie release. Bubbler was developed in 1987 by Ultimate and was released on the Spectrum initially, followed by the Amstrad CPC and MSX. This was Ultimate's last home computer game under that label before they became rare. A Commodore 64 port was also being developed by Linsoft but was never released. It's an isometric platform game similar to Marble Madness, in which you control some sort of blob, jumping your way across an assault course of isometric platforms, avoiding enemies or taking them out by shooting out projectiles. I'm not sure whether the blob you're controlling or the projectiles you shoot are the bubbles, or perhaps both, but presumably one or the other gives Bubbler its name. Although they had working versions running on the C64, which even had some improvements like an improved status panel, they couldn't get around the slowdown that came as a result of the C64's slower CPU. In the end, after Ultimate saw how slow it ran, which was reportedly around 10 to 12 frames per second, they decided to scrap the conversion. Mad Planets was developed in 1984 by Simon Nicol and a friend, and was a conversion of the arcade space shooter of the same name. This would have predated his released Commodore 64 conversion, Crazy Comets. The 1983 arcade original saw the player piloting a ship in space, shooting down planets and moons as they fly towards the screen. In the end, it never got an official home conversion. When you compare this to Crazy Comets, it's clearly inferior, with the planets and moons looking more like solid coloured balls than in Crazy Comets or the arcade original. It has a top-down perspective in contrast to the more 3D perspective that the original had and Crazy Comets managed to replicate faithfully. No huge loss, as Simon Nicol went on to program Crazy Comets in 1985, which was a far superior game, but interesting nonetheless. Putty was released for the Amiga in '92, developed by System 3. It later came to the Super Nintendo and CD32 under the name Super Putty. A platform game, it stars a living blob of putty who can morph into various shapes and objects, stretch to reach higher places or across gaps, and expand to soften fall damage. Very similar to the silly putty we used to have as kids back in the day. System 3 were originally developing the game in 1991 for the Commodore 64, but it became too complicated for the hardware to handle, particularly the number of sprites needed to animate the stretching mechanic. In 2008, the discs containing the last build of the game were rediscovered by the programmer, but this is very much a tech demo rather than a fully playable demo. There are no sound effects or music, although even the Amiga version had no in-game music and it's pretty bare bones. Still, it does show how impressive the stretch animations were for a C64 game. Monster Museum was being developed in or before 1989 by Palace Software. We know this because it was mentioned in a list of Palace's upcoming games in the March 1989 issue of the Games Machine, which incidentally has the Konix multi-system on the cover, which you may remember from my cancelled consoles episode. The article described Monster Museum as an arcade adventure with graphics by Gary Carr and main programming by Andy Wilson. Andy programmed Dan Dare for the Commodore, and Monster Museum's gameplay isn't too dissimilar. You play as a young lady who's the museum curator's daughter. The story is very Night at the Museum. She's locked in the museum overnight, during which time all manner of exhibits come to life. There are several exhibit areas to explore, including a dinosaur gallery, Persian gallery and botanical gardens. You roam the museum, taking on hostile possessed exhibits and using collected objects to solve puzzles. The puzzle solving aspect of the game and its appearance remind me of Maniac Mansion. Monster Museum was believed to be as much as 95% complete. Its development hit several snags, not least of which being that Andy Wilson left Palace Software, and in 1990 they were bought by Titus, who decided to abandon the project. A shame, as it looks like it could have been a great game if this footage is anything to go by. I'm not sure what the weirdest part of this prototype footage is, the toilet monster that covers our heroine in shit, or the fact that she's dry humping this poor prehistoric creature. Cargo was a puzzle game similar in style to Kicks, wherein you navigate a top-down map colouring in sections by travelling around that segment's circumference while avoiding enemies. This was developed by Simon Nicol and Stavros Fasoulas under the Ducksoft label and was intended to be released by Firebird. They allegedly programmed the entire game in one night just to prove that it could be done. Assuming that this is true, we can in turn deduce that Cargo is a complete game, although it has no sound whatsoever, but there's speculation as to whether it was intended for release at all. Mission Jupiter was developed in 1988 by Codemasters, a port of the Spectrum original which came out the previous year. A side-scrolling shooter, it sees you blasting your way through hordes of aliens who've invaded Jupiter. There are 10 levels in all. Ammo and fuel are in limited supply, but these can be replenished by picking up items during the levels. It seems that this was leaked quite early on by a friend of the programmer, so a cracked version was readily available. This may be why Codemasters chose not to release the C64 version, even though the game was completed. Probably one of the most well-known cancelled Commodore games is The Great Giana Sisters. This has a similar past on the Amiga, on which I owned a copied version back in the day and played a lot. This was developed in 1987 by Go, and both Manfred Trans, who did the game's graphics, and the legendary Chris Hulsbeck, who composed the music, went on to work on the highly acclaimed Turrican series. In typical Hulsbeck fashion, the soundtrack in this game is excellent. If you haven't already guessed, it's a straight up rip-off of Mario on the NES. Great Giana Sisters is clearly a play on Super Mario Bros, and the gameplay and level design are unmistakably copied. This is an unusual entry in the series as technically it was released, but only for a week. Nintendo had the game pulled from shelves, so although it was in a way cancelled, there are some legit copies out there. Despite being inferior to Super Mario Bros, it's a fun game, and one that many of us enjoyed back in the days when very few people in the UK had home consoles. Gauntlet 3 is a really interesting one, as many people count it as an official release. In fact, if you check the Wikipedia entry, the Commodore 64 is listed along with the systems that received full releases in 1991, like the Amiga and Atari ST. The third game in the Gauntlet series of dungeon crawlers adopted an isometric viewpoint in contrast to the top-down view of its predecessors, and had a wider roster of 8 playable characters. The C64 version looks pretty impressive for the hardware, and US Gold, who published the other home computer versions, planned to release it alongside the others in '91. It was developed by Software Creations, who prior to this had developed the Commodore 64 ports of Bionic Commando and Ghouls and Ghosts. The official story behind its cancellation at the time was that the programmer was taken ill following a breakdown, and US Gold couldn't transfer Gauntlet 3 from the development system to tape without his assistance. This caused some delays, and the game was then planned to be released on the budget label Kicks, but lo and behold they couldn't get it on tape either. It was however working fine on disc, but there was very little market for disc games, certainly here in the UK, as most people only had the hardware to play tape games. It seems that the real story, according to Games That Weren't, is Software Creations made the programmer redundant and then couldn't get the game onto tape. Congratulations, you played yourself. Where this tale gets very weird is that there are actually disc releases out there, with several being known to exist and thus commanding a pretty penny. In fact, my mate Steve recently found one for a £5 and has kindly provided some pictures for us. You can find his channel Sinisteve in the description. He has a fantastic collection, so head on over and check him out. Rumour has it that these disc releases were distributed in an evaluation form via US Gold's Software Club, but the definitive answer to this is still up in the air. The oddly named Dolphin Force was developed by Falco Paul in 1988 and is a top-down side-scrolling shooter almost identical in design to Uridium. it was planned to have improved gameplay over Uridium with some new features. Falco did the game's graphics himself, having no dedicated artists, which, among other things, caused the game's development to take too long. Dolphin Force never made it past this preview stage, which is roughly 70% complete and has no sound effects, although the intro music is awesome. The source code to Dolphin Force is long gone, so it seems unlikely that we'll ever see anything beyond this preview. Babylon was a working title of a game being developed by Commodore Games in 1996. For the Commodore 64, this would have been a relatively late release. This is a one-level demo with no title and absolutely no sound, but it's more than enough to give us a taste of what could have been. It looks incredible actually when you consider this is running on C64 hardware, having smooth motion, detailed level design and some nice parallax scrolling. Taking inspiration from classics of the genre like Mario, this is a platform game. It plays in a similar fashion too, with the character jumping on enemies and smashing blocks, but he can also throw daggers and flames, the latter of which can light candelabras in addition to taking out enemies. It's unknown if the sinister castle theme would have been a running feature throughout the game, or if it was just for this one level. It was scrapped in the end because the devs were just asking for too much money, and unsurprisingly, seeing as this was 1996, there weren't any developers willing to pick it up. Another cheeky little clone that got pulled was Who Dares Wins, a Commando imitator developed in 1985 by Alligator. This saw a similar fate to Great Giana Sisters in that it did go on sale for a brief period. Copies were sold at a computer show in 1985 and was subsequently on shop shelves for a few days before Elite, who owned the rights to porting the arcade game Commando, saw Who Dares Wins and had it pulled from sale. So, the game's obviously complete, and it has sound effects although no in-game music, but this is common with C64 games in general. It eventually got rehashed into Who Dares Wins 2, which was essentially the same game, but with redesigned levels to make it different enough to Commando. Solar Jetman was a multi-directional shooter, first released in 1990 for Nintendo's NES and PlayChoice 10. 8-bit home computer versions were planned, including the Commodore 64, which was being ported by Software Creations in 1991. Solar Jetman is a shooter which sees you piloting a ship on various planets, picking up ship pieces and fuel using a tow cable. Each level has a different gravity, so this makes controlling your ship much trickier. Very little was known about the game for many years, until some of the team informed Games That Weren't about the conversion. Prior to this, it was thought that it was being ported by Storm, as mentioned in a brief article in Zap magazine. Games That Weren't tracked down the game's programmer John Buckley, and after a lot of searching he managed to find the discs. So, after many years, Solar Jetman was subsequently made available to play on the C64. It seems that it wasn't released due to the subpar sales of the NES version, which is a shame as it looks like a decent conversion. Another platform game that died along with Bugs Bunny when Hi-Tech went bust in '92 was Yogi's Big Cleanup, aka Yogi 3. This would have been the third Yogi Bear game developed by Hi-Tech and did see release on the Amiga and Atari ST. It's a pretty basic platformer in which Yogi travels through 4 levels in Jellystone Park, picking up litter and collecting pieces of various objects. The game was pretty far along by the time Hi-Tech ran into trouble. The levels were pretty much there, but it was pretty buggy and had no music. Yogi sat on development discs for over 20 years until 2015, when the discs were recovered and work began on assembling the constituent parts, finally turning this into a fully playable game. Groovy Electric Death is a strange little puzzle game with an equally bizarre name, programmed by Simon Birrell in 1988. It's a colourful maze game in which you collect objects and avoid monsters while navigating the maze's corridors and moving walls. Simon made the game shortly after leaving university and it was entirely finished, but he couldn't find a publisher. Groovy Electric Death was lost until 2007 when Simon, then living in Spain, discovered the disc. He contacted Games That Weren't, and now the full game has been made playable. Another top-down side-scrolling shooter, an obvious Iridium clone here, Quadrant 4 was developed by Clockwise in 1989. As rumour has it, it was programmed in a short period of 2 to 5 days over Christmas. It was pitched to at least a couple of publishers but didn't garner any interest. After all, Iridium clones and scrolling shooters were abundant on the Commodore 64 at the time, and Quadrant 4 wasn't exactly the best. The graphics looked decent enough, but the gameplay couldn't go head to head with some of the more accomplished shooters available on the C64. We can assume that this was the reason it wasn't released, and as a result it sat on discs for 25 years until it was made playable. Fire Breath was a platform game inspired by Bubble Bobble and Creatures, developed in 1990 by Eric Huimeyer, although I'm probably butchering his name. It was completed and sent off to a publisher, but when they returned the disc without comment, Eric assumed that the game wasn't worthy of publication and left it at that. You play as a creature that looks like a cross between an ant and a poo. A flamethrower is the standard weapon and can be upgraded with collectibles, and there are other items to collect which award points, and a clock which freezes enemies on screen. Each level is represented by a single screen and is set up very similar to Bubble Bobble, and some of the enemies even resemble Bub and Bob. Destroying all enemies on screen will take you to the next level. Fire Breath sat unseen on disc for 26 years until quite recently, and it's now been made playable. I'm not sure which genre Gold Train falls into, as it blends a few gameplay styles. It's sort of a vertical shooter, I suppose. Developed in 1984, Gold Train was programmed by some kids and they managed to sell it to Interceptor for 500 quid. You play as a cowboy on horseback, riding up the screen from a top-down perspective. You ride alongside train tracks in a Western American setting, shooting oncoming enemies and robbing the train's gold. Interceptor wanted some changes made to the unfinished game which had no music or sound, such as more shooting and obstacles. The time frame in which this was needed in time for a show was too short, as several of the original team had gone off to college, and the whole situation resulted in a bit of bad blood. As a result, Gold Train wasn't finished, which is a shame as it looks like it had a lot of potential, but it did end up on the cover of Your Commodore in 1991 in its unfinished state. So those were the first 20 of the 40 unreleased Commodore 64 games that we'll be looking at. Let me know which you think look decent and those that are probably best left on the scrap heap. Thanks again to Games That Weren't for providing such a treasure trove of information, and to those who helped me out with gameplay footage for this episode. I'll see you soon for part 2, and thank you very much for watching. If you want to see the other episodes in my Council Games series, you can find them in this playlist.